The North Atlantic stretched in every direction. Gray and restless, a vast expanse of cold water that seemed to swallow sound and light alike. My grandfather often described it as a place where time slowed, where the ordinary rules of life didn't quite apply, and where a single moment could stretch into an eternity. That day, the submarine he served on was slicing through those waters with its usual precision. Trained to spot threats, to strike before being struck, to see every shadow as a potential enemy. But what happened next would linger in his memory longer than any battle. Any patrol, any victory or defeat. 3 figures appeared on the surface. At first, they were little more than dark shapes on the horizon, bobbing up and down with the swell of the waves. The crew squinted through binoculars and scopes, and then it became clear. 3 men, clinging to a fragile raft, wet and exhausted, drifting helplessly with no oars, no sails, no means of escape. They were Russians, my grandfather said. Survivors of some sunken ship. And for a fleeting moment, they were just 3 people floating in a vast, indifferent ocean. Orders were clear. The rules of engagement in those waters were simple. Enemy soldiers are targets. Remove them before they can pose a threat. A submarine patrol doesn't hesitate. The rifles were ready, the deck gun aimed, and yet nobody fired. Nobody moved. My grandfather recalled the silence as something physical. A weight that pressed down on everyone's chest. It was the kind of silence that fills a ship when all the instincts of war are suddenly challenged by something unexpected. At first, the hesitation seemed like a pause, a delay of professional caution. Maybe they were confirming identity, calculating distance, or assessing risk. But as the minutes ticked by, and the 3 Russians continued to drift with the waves, something deeper settled over the crew. They weren't just waiting. They were questioning. The young sailor near the railing whispered under his breath, "They're not armed. They're nothing." Another muttered, almost to himself, "Are they even soldiers?" That quiet disbelief spread like a contagion, infecting the minds of the entire crew. The 3 men on the raft were a study in exhaustion and vulnerability. One leaned forward, gripping the center post as if it were a lifeline. Another had his face pressed to the wood, staring at the water beneath, his chest heaving, his hair plastered to his forehead. The third slumped backward, arm dangling in the freezing water, shaking slightly with fatigue and cold. They didn't shout, they didn't wave, they didn't look threatening. They were simply alive. And in that simple fact, the first cracks in the soldiers' conditioned response began to appear. My grandfather often emphasized that it wasn't pity. It wasn't sentimentality. It was recognition. For the first time in the war, the men realized they weren't staring at faceless enemies or abstract targets. They were staring at human beings. People who could have been them. Who could have been someone they knew, someone's brother, father, or son. That recognition, he said, was heavier than any weapon, more difficult to bear than any order. It was a confrontation not with the enemy, but with their own conscience. The hours passed slowly. The raft drifted closer, and still the Germans did nothing. They followed at a distance. Careful not to provoke panic. Careful not to act rashly, careful not to break the fragile spell that held the moment in suspense. The younger sailors laughed nervously at one point, trying to shake off the tension, but the laughter sounded hollow even to them. No one wanted to make the first move, to speak aloud the realization they all felt. These men were not a threat. They could fire and obey every rule. Or they could not fire and acknowledge a deeper truth about themselves. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the tiny, sodden figures on the raft. My grandfather said the sight was almost surreal. Men who were supposed to represent the enemy, stripped of all military bearing, all armor, all aggression, reduced to wet, shivering, utterly human forms. It was a revelation in miniature, a moment where war paused and allowed conscience to surface. They weren't soldiers in formation, ready to fight. They were people clinging to a piece of wood, terrified of the sea and of death. He remembered one older sailor muttering quietly to the man beside him, "We could shoot. But we can't. Not like this." And it was true. Even if they had obeyed orders, even if they had pulled the trigger, the act would have felt wrong. It would have left a scar deeper than any wound. Because in those moments, the enemy ceased to be a faceless concept. They became human, and the crew had to reconcile the tension between duty and morality. The Germans continued to shadow the raft for hours, moving cautiously, silently, letting the currents carry the 3 Russians. They debated in whispers whether to approach, to offer help, or to maintain distance. My grandfather always said that debate was invisible to the men on the raft, but it was palpable to everyone on the submarine. It was in the way the crew avoided eye contact, in the way the rifles were lowered, in the slow, Deliberate movements of people aware that the smallest decision could mean life or death. Eventually, the sun began to set, casting a cold golden glow across the water. The three Russians drifted further from view, moving toward a patch of debris where driftwood and broken crates offered a minimal refuge. The Germans followed at a respectful distance, never taking their eyes off them. Not because they feared retaliation, but because they were unwilling to break the fragile truce that existed in that instant. My grandfather described the feeling as a mix of relief and awe. A strange cocktail of victory over instinct and surrender to conscience. When the raft finally disappeared into the horizon, the crew remained silent. The radio operator didn't even touch the dial. My grandfather said the moment felt like a pause in time. A rare instance where the mechanics of war, the orders, the training, the strategic imperatives, were set aside in favor of something more profound. Humanity. It wasn't a heroic act, not in the conventional sense. There were no medals, no commendations, no reports to file. It was a choice that had no audience, no witness, except for the men who lived it. He often reflected on that day, not with pride, but with quiet reverence for what it had revealed. War has a way of reducing life to black and white, but in those hours, the lines blurred. The enemy was no longer a concept, no longer a target. He was flesh and blood, fatigue and fear. And in recognizing that, the submarine crew discovered something extraordinary. The courage to act against the easy, the expected, the trained response, and instead honor the fragile, fleeting dignity of life. When I asked him why the story stayed with him, why he repeated it again and again, he said it was because of the silence. The hesitation. The quiet choice to do nothing when doing something would have been simpler, safer, and cleaner. It wasn't a story of combat. It was a story of conscience. A story of human instinct prevailing over the machinery of war. A story that, he said, reminded him, and all who heard it, that even in the darkest circumstances, humanity can endure. The Atlantic eventually swallowed the raft from view. The three Russians carried by currents beyond reach. The submarine continued its patrol. But my grandfather and the crew carried a different weight from that day onward. Not the weight of kills. Not the weight of strategy. But the weight of what they had chosen not to do. The lesson that life is more than orders. That the enemy is more than a target, and that sometimes the bravest act in war is restraint. Even now, as I recount the story, I can feel the tension. The cold, the gray expanse of the ocean, and the fragile life drifting across it. It lingers not because of fear, but because of recognition. Because in the silence, in the hesitation, in the decision to spare life, something extraordinary is revealed about who we are, even in war. And that, my grandfather said, is a lesson that no gun, no torpedo, no battle can ever teach.